May 11, 1943. The Aleutian Islands, Alaska. American soldiers crouch in landing craft as they approach Attu Island through fog so thick they can barely see the beach ahead. Private William Jones would later describe it. We landed in fog as thick as mashed potatoes, expecting a wild dash across the beach with bullets flying, and there weren't any. The Japanese had gone further inland. The Americans would have to find them, and for the next 18 days they would fight one of the most brutal battles in American history. A battle where frostbite killed more men than enemy fire, where weapons froze solid in soldiers' hands, where men died not just from bullets but from a landscape that seemed determined to kill everyone on it. This was the Battle of Attu, the only land battle of World War II fought on American soil, and somehow it became known as the Forgotten Battle. This is that story. To understand how American soldiers ended up fighting on their own territory, we need to go back 1 year, to June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had designed a complex operation for early June 1942. The main objective was the capture of Midway Island, a strategic American base in the Central Pacific. But Yamamoto had a second objective, a diversion. He would strike at the Aleutian Islands, the chain of volcanic islands stretching 1,200 miles west from Alaska into the Pacific Ocean. The plan seemed logical. The Aleutians were American territory, sparsely defended. An attack there would force the U.S. Navy to split its forces. While Americans scrambled to defend Alaska, Japanese carriers could destroy what remained of the Pacific Fleet at Midway. On June 3, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Dutch Harbor, a major American base in the Aleutians. The raids killed 78 Americans, destroyed fuel storage facilities, and damaged the naval base. But the diversion didn't work. American intelligence had already broken Japanese codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew Midway was the real target. He didn't divert forces to Alaska. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4-7, ended in catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Japan lost its offensive capability in the Pacific. The war's momentum shifted permanently to the United States. But before the defeat at Midway became clear, Japanese forces had already executed the second part of their Aleutian operation. On June 6, Japanese troops landed on Kiska Island. On June 7, they landed on Attu, the westernmost island in the Aleutian chain. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops occupied American soil. Attu Island was home to 45 indigenous Unangax people. They had lived on these remote islands for thousands of years, sustaining themselves through fishing, hunting, and seal harvesting. When Japanese soldiers arrived, the Unangax found themselves in the middle of a war they barely understood. The Japanese initially treated the Unangax civilians as prisoners of war. On September 14, 1942, all 45 Unangax residents of Attu were forcibly removed from their homes and transported to Japan. They were imprisoned in the city of Otaru on the northern island of Hokkaido, where they endured 3 years of captivity in conditions that can only be described as brutal. 20 of the 45 Unangax prisoners, nearly half, would die in captivity from disease, malnutrition, and the harsh conditions. The survivors would not be allowed to return to Attu after the war. The U.S. government, claiming the island was too remote and dangerous, would resettle them elsewhere in the Aleutians. The Unangax people of Attu lost not just their homes but their homeland forever. Meanwhile, Japanese forces fortified both Attu and Kiska. They built anti-aircraft positions, coastal defense guns, and underground bunkers. By early 1943, approximately 2,500 Japanese soldiers occupied Attu, and 5,000 more were stationed on Kiska. Back in the United States, public outrage was immediate. Japanese forces were occupying American territory. The enemy was within striking distance of the American mainland. Something had to be done. But American military planners faced a dilemma. Resources were stretched thin. The campaign in the South Pacific demanded men, ships, and equipment. Planning for the invasion of North Africa and eventually Europe consumed the Atlantic theater. The Aleutian Islands, while American territory, seemed strategically insignificant compared to these larger operations. Yet they couldn't be ignored. Japanese control of the Aleutians threatened supply routes to the Soviet Union. It provided potential bases for attacks on the American West Coast, and psychologically, allowing enemy forces to occupy American soil was intolerable. By January 1943, the decision was made. The United States would retake the Aleutian Islands. The question was how. Major General Albert Brown commanded the operation. He faced challenges unlike anything American forces had encountered elsewhere in the Pacific. The Aleutian Islands are among the most inhospitable places on Earth. Constant fog reduces visibility to yards. Winds regularly exceed 100 miles per hour. Rain and snow fall year-round. The volcanic terrain is treacherous, mountainous, rocky, and covered in a spongy moss called muskeg that can swallow vehicles and equipment. Temperatures hover just above or below freezing even in summer. American soldiers would be fighting in conditions worse than anything at Guadalcanal or New Guinea. They would need specialized equipment, cold weather clothing, and training for Arctic warfare. Most critically, they would need to understand that the environment might be as deadly as the enemy. Brown chose Attu for the first assault. Intelligence suggested it was less heavily defended than Kiska. The plan called for an amphibious landing at multiple beaches, followed by a rapid convergence on Japanese positions before the enemy could organize an effective defense. The 7th Infantry Division was assigned to the operation. Most of these soldiers had trained for desert warfare in North Africa. They had never seen conditions like the Aleutians. They were issued standard wool uniforms, leather boots, and equipment designed for temperate climates. It would prove woefully inadequate. On April 24, 1943, the invasion force departed from Cold Bay, Alaska. 30 transports, 3 battleships, an escort carrier, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, over 100 ships carrying 11,000 American soldiers toward Attu Island. The soldiers had no idea what awaited them. May 11, 1943, dawn, or what passed for dawn in the perpetual fog of the Aleutians. Landing craft approached the beaches of Attu from 3 directions: Massacre Bay in the south, Holtz Bay in the north, and the narrow beach at Red Beach on the east side of the island. The plan was to land simultaneously, trap Japanese forces in the center of the island, and crush them before they could establish defensive positions. The fog was so thick that landing craft navigating toward shore could barely see their own bow. Soldiers crouched in the boats, soaked from spray, shivering from cold, weapons clutched in frozen hands. Then the landing craft hit the beach. The ramps dropped. Soldiers poured out expecting immediate enemy fire. Nothing happened. The beaches were empty. The Japanese had withdrawn inland to prepare defensive positions in the mountains. They had no intention of fighting on the beaches. They would make the Americans come to them. Within hours, the initial relief turned to misery. The soldiers discovered that everything about Attu was wrong. The muskeg, that spongy volcanic moss, swallowed their boots with every step. Men sank to their knees, then their waists. Walking required exhausting effort. Equipment got stuck. Artillery pieces and vehicles became completely immobilized. The fog never lifted. Visibility remained less than 50 yards. Units lost contact with each other. Officers couldn't see their own men. Coordination became impossible. And then there was the cold. Temperatures hovered between 20 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Constant rain and snow soaked through clothing. The standard leather boots issued to the soldiers offered no insulation and no water resistance. Within hours, men's feet were wet. Within days, frostbite began appearing. Weapons froze. The M1 Garand rifle, standard infantry weapon of the U.S. Army, repeatedly jammed when its internal mechanisms iced over. Machine guns froze solid and became useless. Mortars misfired. Artillery pieces had to be thawed with fires before they could operate. The soldiers discovered they were fighting 2 enemies, the Japanese and Attu itself. The Japanese commander on Attu was Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki. He commanded approximately 2,500 troops well supplied and deeply entrenched in defensive positions throughout the island's mountains. Yamasaki had spent months preparing. He knew the terrain, he knew the weather, and he knew exactly how to use both against the Americans. Japanese positions were built into the mountainsides, bunkers carved from the volcanic rock, machine gun nests concealed in fog, artillery positioned on reverse slopes where American naval bombardment couldn't touch them. Every approach was pre-sighted and covered by interlocking fields of fire. American soldiers advancing through the muskeg and fog walked into carefully prepared killing zones. Japanese machine guns would open fire from invisible positions. Americans would drop into the moss, trying to return fire but unable to see their targets. By the time soldiers located the enemy position and called for artillery support, the fog would thicken and the Japanese would disappear. Progress was measured in yards per day. The 7th Infantry Division, expected to secure Attu in 3 days, found itself bogged down in a grinding battle of attrition. Casualties mounted, but not primarily from combat. Frostbite and exposure injuries exceeded battle wounds. Soldiers' feet froze in their inadequate boots. Trench foot, a condition where prolonged exposure to cold and wet causes tissue to die, became epidemic. Men who'd been walking one day couldn't stand the next. By May 16, 5 days into the battle, over 500 Americans had been evacuated for cold weather injuries. Only 50 had been wounded in combat. The soldiers improvised. They wrapped their feet in newspaper for insulation. They stuffed extra socks into their boots. They learned to keep their weapons inside their jackets to prevent freezing. They discovered that small fires could keep positions warm but also drew Japanese mortar fire. They learned to move slowly and constantly check on the men beside them, because in the fog, entire squads could wander off course and disappear. Food was a constant problem. Supplies landed on the beaches but couldn't be moved inland through the muskeg. Artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, and rations piled up at the shore while soldiers in the mountains went hungry. Pack animals were tried. They sank in the moss and had to be shot. Vehicles were useless. Everything had to be carried by hand over terrain that exhausted men within hours. Meanwhile, Japanese forces conserved their strength, withdrew when pressed, and struck back when Americans became overextended. Yamasaki was fighting a patient, defensive battle. He knew he couldn't win, but he could make the Americans pay for every yard. By May 20, the situation had become critical. The 7th Infantry Division was exhausted, depleted, and stalled. Reinforcements arrived. The 4th Infantry Regiment was helicoptered in, fresh troops with better cold weather equipment. They pushed forward. Finally, on May 28, American forces broke through Japanese defensive lines and approached the main Japanese positions near Chichagof Harbor. Colonel Yamasaki found himself surrounded. His troops were running out of food and ammunition. Resupply by sea was impossible. American naval forces controlled the waters around Attu. Yamasaki made a decision: one final attack. The night of May 28, 1943, American positions near Massacre Bay, soldiers huddled in foxholes, exhausted from 18 days of continuous combat and exposure. Most hadn't eaten a hot meal in a week. Many were suffering from frostbite. All were hoping the battle was nearly over. At 3:00 a.m. on May 29, Japanese soldiers began moving through the fog. Silently, hundreds of them. Colonel Yamasaki had gathered every able-bodied man: combat troops, clerks, medics, cooks, approximately 1,000 soldiers armed with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Many carried only bamboo spears or knives. The plan was simple: overrun the American positions, capture supplies and weapons, push through to the American rear areas, cause chaos, make the Americans believe they were facing a larger counterattack. At 3:30 a.m., the Japanese attacked. It was one of the largest Banzai charges of the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers emerged from the fog screaming. They hit American positions that were spread thin and poorly prepared for a nighttime assault. In some areas, they broke through completely. The fighting became brutal and chaotic: hand-to-hand combat in the darkness and fog, bayonets and knives, some Japanese soldiers armed only with rocks or wooden clubs. The charge was less a tactical operation than a final, desperate act of defiance. Japanese forces penetrated deep into American lines. They overran medical aid stations. They captured supply dumps. For several terrifying hours, American commanders feared the entire front was collapsing. But the Banzai Charge had a fatal flaw. Once launched, it couldn't be controlled or redirected. Japanese soldiers had no reserves, no fallback positions, no support. They had committed everything to one attack. As dawn broke, such as it was through the perpetual Aleutian fog, American forces began to reorganize. Artillery batteries that had been overrun were recaptured. Infantry units that had been scattered reformed. Machine gun positions were reestablished. The Japanese charge ran out of momentum. Soldiers who had fought through the night were exhausted. They had no ammunition left, no food, no reinforcements. By midday on May 29, the Banzai Charge had been stopped. Japanese forces that had penetrated American lines found themselves isolated and surrounded. Small groups continued fighting throughout the day, but the outcome was inevitable. Colonel Yamasaki was killed during the charge. Most of his officers died with him. Of the approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers who participated in the Banzai Charge, almost none survived. American burial teams would later count 2,351 Japanese dead on Attu. Only 28 Japanese soldiers were captured alive, and none of them were officers. American casualties from the Banzai Charge and the entire Battle of Attu were staggering. 549 Americans killed in action, 1,148 wounded, another 1,200 evacuated for severe cold weather injuries including frostbite and trench foot. Over 2,100 additional soldiers would eventually require medical treatment for cold-related conditions. The Battle of Attu, which military planners had expected to last 3 days, had taken 18 days and cost over 3,000 American casualties. It was one of the deadliest battles in the Pacific Campaign relative to the forces involved. On May 30, 1943, Attu was declared secure. The American flag was raised over the island. For the first time since June 1942, no Japanese forces occupied American territory. Except they still did. On Kiska Island, 5,000 Japanese soldiers remained. After the brutal experience at Attu, American military planners were determined that the assault on Kiska would be different. They would use overwhelming force. They would equip soldiers with proper cold weather gear. They would take no chances. For over 2 months, American aircraft and naval vessels pounded Kiska. Thousands of bombs were dropped. Shells rained down constantly. Every suspected Japanese position was targeted. Reconnaissance flights reported no changes in Japanese defenses. Intelligence estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Japanese troops remained dug in on the island. On August 15, 1943, the invasion began. Operation Cottage. A combined American-Canadian force of 34,426 troops landed on Kiska, the largest amphibious assault force in the North Pacific during the entire war. They came prepared for fierce resistance. The landing craft hit the beaches. Thousands of soldiers poured ashore expecting immediate combat. Nothing happened. The beaches were empty, soldiers moved inland cautiously, still nothing, patrols pushed forward, they found Japanese positions, bunkers, trenches, artillery emplacements, all abandoned. For several days, Allied forces scoured Kiska Island looking for the enemy. They found booby traps, they found abandoned equipment, they found a few dogs that had been left behind, but no Japanese soldiers. The entire Japanese garrison, all 5,183 troops, had been evacuated on July 28, nearly 3 weeks before the Allied invasion. Under cover of dense fog, Japanese ships had crept into Kiska Harbor and removed every soldier without American forces detecting anything. It should have been a bloodless victory, it wasn't. On August 16, a Canadian soldier hearing movement in the fog fired at what he thought were Japanese troops. He was shooting at American positions. Other soldiers hearing gunfire assumed they were under attack and began firing. The result was a tragic friendly fire incident. By the time someone realized the mistake and got the shooting stopped, 28 Americans and 4 Canadians had been killed. Another 50 were wounded. The Battle of Kiska ended with 313 total Allied casualties, all from friendly fire, booby traps, disease, and accidents. Not a single casualty from enemy action because there were no enemies on the island. On August 24, 1943, Kiska was declared secure. The Aleutian campaign was over. American territory had been completely reclaimed. The entire campaign had cost over 3,800 American casualties. Another 5,000 had been evacuated for cold weather injuries, ships had been sunk, aircraft had been lost, millions of dollars had been spent. And within months, almost nobody in America knew it had happened. How does a battle fought on American soil become forgotten? How do thousands of casualties, 18 days of brutal combat, and the only land battle of World War II fought in North America simply disappear from national memory? There are several reasons. First, timing. The Battle of Attu occurred in May 1943. That same summer, Allied forces invaded Sicily. The campaign in North Africa was reaching its climax. The strategic bombing of Germany was intensifying. The battle for Guadalcanal had just concluded. news from the Aleutians was overshadowed by events happening in more dramatic and strategically significant theaters. Second, geography. The Aleutian Islands are remote. Few Americans had ever heard of Attu or Kiska before the war. Even fewer could find them on a map. The islands lacked the dramatic familiarity of places like Pearl Harbor or the emotional resonance of defending European soil. Third, censorship and security. Many details about the Aleutian campaign remained classified during the war. The harsh conditions, the high casualty rates, and the friendly fire incident at Kiska were considered damaging to morale. Military officials downplayed the campaign's difficulties. Fourth, narrative. American war propaganda emphasized offensive victories and dramatic battles. The Aleutian campaign didn't fit that narrative. It was a defensive operation to reclaim lost territory. It lacked the triumphant quality of island hopping across the Pacific or liberating France. And finally, the soldiers themselves. Veterans of Attu came home to a country that barely knew where they'd fought. When they tried to explain what they'd experienced, the cold, the fog, the muskeg, the conditions worse than combat, people didn't understand. The veterans eventually stopped talking about it. The Aleutian Campaign became the forgotten battle, a chapter of World War II that simply faded from history. But the battle wasn't forgotten by everyone. The Unangax people never forgot. They lost their homeland. Half of the Attu residents died in Japanese captivity. The survivors were never allowed to return. The islands they'd inhabited for thousands of years became military zones, then wildlife refuges. The Unangax culture of Attu was destroyed by the war. In 1988, Congress formally apologized to the Unangax people for their treatment during World War II and provided limited compensation. In 2017, descendants of Attu residents were finally able to visit the island for the first time since their ancestors were forcibly removed in 1942. The Japanese remember. On Attu, a peace memorial was erected on Engineer Hill where some of the fiercest fighting occurred. It commemorates soldiers from both sides who died there. Every year, descendants of Japanese soldiers who fought at Attu make pilgrimages to the island to honor their ancestors. And slowly, Americans are beginning to remember. In 2019, the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Attu brought renewed attention. Veterans, the few remaining, shared their stories. Historians published new research. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which now manages Attu as part of the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, hosted commemorative events. Today, Attu Island is one of the most remote places in the United States. There are no permanent residents, no roads, no facilities. Visiting requires special permission and is incredibly difficult. The battlefields remain largely as they were in 1943, rusting equipment, collapsed bunkers, bomb craters slowly filling with vegetation. It's a landscape frozen in time. The Peace Memorial stands on Engineer Hill. The inscription reads, "In memory of all those who sacrificed their lives in the islands and seas of the North Pacific during World War II and in dedication to world peace." The Battle of Attu was America's only World War II battle fought on home soil. It was one of the deadliest campaigns in the Pacific relative to the forces involved. It demonstrated the incredible hardships soldiers can endure when fighting not just an enemy, but an environment determined to kill them. The soldiers who fought at Attu faced conditions that most people cannot imagine: temperatures below freezing, constant fog, terrain that swallowed equipment and exhausted men, weapons that froze solid, and an enemy that had spent months preparing defenses in that hostile landscape. They fought for 18 days, they suffered over 3,000 casualties, they won. And then, for over half a century, almost nobody knew it had happened. The forgotten battle reminds us that heroism doesn't always occur in famous places. That sacrifice isn't less meaningful because it happens in remote locations. And that the fog of war isn't always metaphorical, sometimes it's literal and it never lifts. The soldiers who fought at Attu deserve to be remembered. Their battle deserves to be told. Because forgetting these stories means forgetting the full cost of victory. This was the Battle of Attu, the forgotten battle, and now you know. If this story was new to you, subscribe to Wartime Secrets for more forgotten stories from World War II. What other unknown battles from WW2 should we cover? Let us know in the comments. And if you have a family connection to the Aleutian campaign, please share it. These stories need to be preserved.